Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Happily Ever After podcast. I'm your host, Shabbir Hassan. This is a podcast dedicated to everything on marriage and relationships in Islam. Today, really excited. We're going to be talking about, we're going to come to the marriage side, but mainly we're going to talk about the wedding, right? Because the wedding is a huge element, part of the marriage. It's what everybody's dreaming of. And we're going to talk about that and go into a lot more detail. Today's guest, really, really special. We've got Ustadh Ibrahim Khan. He is the co-founder of Islamic Finance Guru, and he's got a lot to share with us today. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How's it going, Shabbir?
Alhamdulillah, very, very well. And thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Not bad at all. Not bad at all.
Yeah?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. I'm always down to talk about weddings and marriages and hopefully point a few people in the right direction around this topic.
Yeah, inshallah. We definitely need some guidance here. Like I said, it's an interesting topic because, weddings, I mean, especially for us as Muslims, that's a big thing, Weddings is something that, like I said, people are dreaming of growing up, dreaming of the perfect wedding, the perfect day. But we're going to kind of like break that apart, that kind of thing, and go into a lot more detail, inshallah. Yeah, so the first thing I guess I wanted to talk about, because the reason why I wanted to speak to you as well is because you've already done some research on this, and you even put out a video. It's on YouTube right now, about basically Muslim weddings, right? And what was the figure that was on the title?
Oh,
Like something
1.5 billion.
1.5 billion
Yeah.
pound black hole, right? Is that that's the
Yeah.
title, right? Yeah. So yeah, that was interesting title. I watched that and I was like, wow, okay, there's a lot of things that I learned there, but there's a lot of things I can relate to as well. Attending like so many weddings over the past few years. So let's start with that. Like that must have been some interesting research and some interesting findings that you would have come across, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me at IFG, what we're trying to do is, for us, the key thing is we want to make Muslims wealthier, better off economically, right? And everything we do kind of goes to that. So I kind of look around and think, okay, so there's various different bits and pieces of a Muslim's life, and how can we kind of optimize that from an economic perspective? And I mean, we recently quit and went full time on IFG, so at the moment we're just getting started. So I'm like going for the big ones right now.
Yeah.
Marriage is a massive one because Muslims, as you rightly said, right? Because I think the reason why Muslims care so much about marriage is because, firstly, boyfriend and girlfriend is off the table, so you have to get married. And then I think the second thing is, particularly for women, I think with non-Muslims in the UK, because there's much more of a drive these days towards having a career. That they focus on that initially, and then their focus shifts towards towards getting married. Whereas for Muslim women, I think there is still a lot of respect given to housewives, and I think that's a great thing. But to become a housewife, you need to become a wife, right? So that's why I think a lot of focus goes to marriage. And when I kind of started digging into this area, I was really, really shocked by the numbers I found. So in 2007, this Asian bridal magazine called Via did a survey where they found that a quarter of people are spending between 20 and 30,000, and another quarter are spending around 50 to 75,000. And that was back in 2007, and we're 13 years on from there. And having talked to a few people anecdotally, and also just generally surveyed the market and looked at what's going on, I think it's very, very conservative to say that the average Muslim wedding is about £50,000, and I think that is just bonkers. Like and to give you a sense of how bonkers it is, the rough spend of Asian weddings out of the £10 billion that's spent on Muslim marriages every year is half. And Asian weddings, of course, includes Indians, Sikhs, and Muslims, Arabs, etc. So out of that, I model a conservative £2 billion is what Muslims spend, given that we are much, much bigger in population than the Indian community. And yes, the Indian community, I'm sure, spend a lot more, but overall, we are spending a lot. So I'm conservatively saying 2 billion. But given that, we only constitute about 5% of the population, that should really be 500 million. And it's not, it's 2 billion. So that means that we are spending, at least 1.5 billion more than we should be. And that is a massive number. It's obscene. Like, we know, to give you a more context around 1.5 billion, that's like 15 times what we would raise in Ramadan for charities. We do that every single year on marriages. That's the excess that we do every single year on marriages.
Wow, those figures are just like crazy, absolutely crazy. What I'm actually interested in, like, trying to find out is, because if you think about perhaps like the average age that Muslims get married, right? I mean, I'm thinking, nowadays, I don't know, maybe mid-20s, around that age. I mean, people get married at different ages, but then to think about, right, that let's say we take a 25, 26-year-old, right, a few years into their careers, right, after graduating from university, carrying, as you know, the weight of that debt around from uni anyway. And then, like, the prospect of having a £50,000 wedding. I mean, this is your field, right? So you tell me, like, how likely is it that that individual would have £50,000 in the bank to spend on a wedding as a 25, 26-year-old? Do you think that's really possible without taking out some loans and fishing around elsewhere?
Absolutely not, I think, for most people. I mean, me thinking back to 25, 26-year-old, I used to, work in the city. And even there, like, starting salaries, you're looking at somewhere between 30 and 50,000 if you're very lucky. And, with that, you're going to struggle to save that amount of money very quickly. And that means that for the average person, where the average salary is somewhere between 28 and 30ish, that's going to be a real struggle, because what that in effect means is that you're saving up a massive chunk of your salary every month, which is just not feasible, right? It's just not sustainable. So, in other words, what we are doing is, I think, frankly, is pushing Muslims towards haram. Because if you are saying, oh, the only halal way to have a relationship with the other gender is through marriage. Oh, and by the way, you've got to pay an entry fee of like 50,000, 100,000, whatever it is, and you can't afford that. Then what's the playbook then? What do you do instead? And I think that we don't have data on it necessarily, at least that I didn't come across. But I think that a lot of people are being pushed into haram relationships because of this, I think, cultural baggage that we kind of place on ourselves.
Yeah, and they're just going to basically be put off getting married for a long time, even if they aren't pushed into a haram relationship. They're just like, I've actually met people that have said, like, I'm really just not feeling it, and like, it does boil down to the finances at the end of the day. But we'll come to, does it have to be like that? We'll come to that shortly. One other interesting thing that you mentioned in the video is how not only is it un-Islamic, and again, we'll come to that. Not that I want to make this podcast episode, about lecturing people on, I think most people watching kind of know that it's not really the best and ideal situational scenario to be in. A lot of people maybe do it unwillingly. We'll come to that, but you also mentioned it's uneconomic. So again, as the expert, do you mind explaining to us how spending maybe £50,000 on a wedding is uneconomic, apart from the fact that it damages your pocket and your wallet, etc.? But how is that uneconomic?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different ways to kind of frame this. One is, I think, from a personal perspective, and then the second is from a kind of community perspective as well. So, from a personal perspective, let's say you're going to spend 50,000 on a wedding. Of that, you're probably going to spend about 50% of it on the wedding venue, and about maybe 25% of it on the honeymoon. and the majority, therefore, of the costs will be going to basically large corporations or wealthy people. So if you think about the net transfer there of money, you're taking it from your pocket and giving it to the wealthy. And for a community that's already quite poor, I generally discourage that kind of behavior. And I think the other kind of thing to think about is, okay, let's think about it from a personal perspective. Let's instead do a budget wedding at 15K. What else could I have done with that 35K? And so that 35K, if you invest that, and people often don't realize the value of compound investing and the build up of money over time. If you invest that 35K, and let's say this couple got married with 15K, you gave them that 35K instead and said, look, guys, just invest it. And they put that away. After 20 years, that will net them about 112, 113,000 pounds. And it could be a bit more, it could be a bit less. Now, university fees are 27,000 at the moment these days. So that means that this couple in 20 years' time, with that 35K, they could more than pay for the entire uni fees of 3 of their kids. Now that is massive, right? So on one hand, they've had a great wedding for one day, and then they've kind of had to pay off the debts for the next 5, 6, 7, 10 years even. Or on the other hand, they've had a great wedding, because it's all about the memories, really, ultimately, when you think about weddings, and you'll still have them even if it's a budget one. And then they've saved them a whole load of heartache for the next 10 years, no debt, and you've saved them a whole load of headache at the university stage, where people really start struggling. And then it's a generational thing as well, right? Because if those 3 kids don't have to pay student loans, then they have saved over their generation about £225,000. Now, that is that is a game changer. So that 35K that you take that decision at that point has such a massive knock-on effect on the rest of that family, that family's economic life.
Wow. So it's like a super long-term investment when you think about it. We're not just talking here, it benefiting you. We're talking now beyond that, like thinking about your children and things like that. And I really like that, because I genuinely feel like, especially as like imams as well, we do advise, like, before you get married, obviously the person that you're marrying isn't just going to be like, you shouldn't just think so short term, like, yeah, next few years I'm going to spend with this person. Like, you have to think about your children, you've got to think about the future generations. Like, ultimately it's a legacy, right? It sounds as cliched as it sounds, marriage actually is a legacy. Now, financially speaking as well, the way that you've kind of broken things down, it does really put things into perspective, because I just feel like most people, I think it's safe to say, don't think like this, right? Or they don't, or maybe they figure it out too late. Like, the amount of people that I've met that have literally, like, a few days after their wedding, forget months or years, they literally like, what, why did I do that for? What was the point getting that Rolls Royce and the DJ and whatever? Like, it was just unnecessary spending. So for me personally, I have not met a single individual that, after spending a substantial amount of money on their weddings, that has turned around to me and said, you know what, that was well worth it. Like, I am super happy with that. Genuinely, just is crazy to think about. It's crazy to think about.
I agree with you, and I think that it's we need to kind of reprogram ourselves. And I start with myself first. I think I think overspent on my wedding. Maybe I think I spent I think I mentioned it in the video. I can't remember what the figure was now. 15K, was it? Or yeah, I think it was 15K. But I don't think ultimately I perhaps needed to spend 15K. I think I could have pushed that down to sub 10K. And still had a fairly good wedding. And I think that there's a wider kind of point here about the community as well, because if we all need to make that individual decision on what we do with our wedding, then that has a really wide impact on other people, and it makes it okay for them to have a more sensible price wedding. And if all of us do it, that 1.5 billion pounds is saved. And to give you kind of a sense of what that could achieve, like the Church of England has an endowment of £8 billion. So the Church of England probably makes about 500 million or so, I would say, in just income every year without doing anything. And churches are, both you and I know that, churches are not that active these days. Lots of them are being closed down. It's a declining, institution, and yet they have a massive amount of money to do all sorts of things with. Now, Muslims with 1.5 billion, we could catch up to that in 6-7 years if we just consistently, plug that away into a Muslim kind of, I don't know, Waqf fund or something, and that money really quickly adds up. That means, practically, that means that all these masajid that have dodgy wudu facilities, or those madaris where you've got that scary looking imam from Pakistan or India who beats up kids, that no longer happens. And you've got mosques where Islamic schools where they're really struggling to have any good teachers, or the good teachers only stay for a while because there isn't good pay. All of that could disappear overnight just by us sorting out our Muslim marriages and then thinking about how we can effectively pull that money elsewhere. But if we don't, then I guess we kind of continue limping along.
Yeah, and I'm glad you were honest as well. Like you said, you personally felt like you did overspend on your wedding. You could have maybe been a bit more conservative with the costing, and I feel the same way, to be honest with you. I feel like, yeah, looking back, perhaps it could have, like we did, I guess we did the best we could, but then you look back and you think, no, you know what, there's so many things that we could have really worked on. And let's just quickly focus on that for a while, because we don't want to just bash people here and say, oh, you guys are just going around spending money, because like I said, there's clearly some underlying problems and reasons, right? And a lot of the young couples that I speak to today, genuinely, if they had the chance, they would literally go get the nikah done in some masjid, and they would be happy and they would just carry on with their lives. Genuinely, that I've almost every young couple that we get married off literally says, we don't really want this wedding. So what's the reason? One key factor that's part of this is like families and that pressure, right? So the pressure from families and relatives is, well, you can't just get away with a small nikah in the masjid, because let's think about South Asian communities, let's think about Middle Eastern families, let's think about East African families, right? The Somali community, the Bangladesh Pakistani community, right? I mean, big families, right? So for me, like, as much as I for my wedding would have loved to have said, you know what, I only want 50 people there, like, you've got 40 cousins, forget, what about your aunties, your uncles? So there clearly is this pressure. And what other reasons do you think, do you think it's just family pressure? Do you think there's other reasons as well, or do you think that's the main thing?
Yeah, I think that there's family pressure. I mean, my wife had five. There are six siblings in total, and they've got, and one of the brothers, my brother-in-law, has 12 kids.
Wow,
So
mashallah.
her family alone, I think, are like 30 to 50. So without thinking about any of their in-laws and anything like that, I think that there's kind of two ways to go about this. One way is to have your wedding with a decent kind of 3-course meal, and sit down at the tables at the local restaurant and invite like 10 people with the same budget. Or you could do it, I think a lot of Gujis actually do this, which I think is quite good, Gujaratis, where they hire out a community hall, and it'll just be very, very simple affair, but they'll have everyone in there, right? And they'll maybe do like 100, 200, even 300 people, but it's just a very budget wedding.
Yeah.
And it's no frills. And that way, everyone turns up. They don't feel left out. But you do then have to be comfortable doing a no frills wedding. And I think that takes guts. And I think that is where the kind of societal pressure kicks in. And there's no real kind of simple solution to this, because if you've been invited to 10 Hilton weddings by your neighbors and family, and then you turn up to you get them to turn up to a community center down the road from where you live, and there you are sat on the floor on a chadar on top of the badminton court, they might well talk about things, right? And you need to have a thick skin, and I think people, that's what they're scared of a lot of the time, and understandably so. And I think that the solution to that is to frame it in this way: that look, either you kind of take the hit, and I'm talking here to the parents, they take the hit for that one day, and they take a little bit of the kind of the social stigma that they'll attract. And actually, I think it's not too much. I think people often overrate how much it is. Um, or they burden their children or themselves with a lifetime or a very long period of time of debt, and they add to this institution, this culture that will destroy, if not their lives, the lives of many others because of this. And I think if you frame it in that way, I think it's a very obvious choice that we kind of take the hit for that day, and over time it'll become easier and easier. Like if you've got 4 kids and you take that hit the first time, you will be very, very thankful by the time the fourth kid comes along, because there won't be any stigma anymore, because even your own family will be used to that badminton court. They know their place by that point. They'll be like, no, that corner is mine, and they'll go and find it themselves. And there's no really easy way. I think you just kind of think of it as, who do I love more? The views of my neighbors for a day, or the happiness of my child for a lifetime. I think it's quite easy then.
Yeah, it reminds me, there's once basically I was organizing a nikah for a couple, and the groom, he was white, right? So he's a revert to Islam. So a lot of his family members are non-Muslim. He was marrying into, I think, a Pakistani family. The bride was from Pakistani descent, and so we were having a phone conversation, and I was asking him, yeah, what's going to happen on the day? Can you just tell us about the number of guests that are coming? So we want to get an idea to organize a nikah. So he said, Imam, please don't mention numbers to me. Honestly, I've got a headache about it. Too many people are coming. And I said, whoa, I'm thinking, 700-800, that's like standard. I'm like, how many people are coming? He goes, 38 people are coming to the wedding. And I was like, what? You're stressing over 38 people coming to, that's nothing. He goes, no, 38 for my family is big. We do like 10 to 12 people. And the thing is, obviously, because of his background, like, it does seem to be a very Muslim problem. Do you get what I mean? Like mainstream weddings, you go to like a church when they have their ceremonies, barely any people there, right? But then you come to like a Muslim wedding. Again, I get it. We spoke about the families, etc. And this is where I want to just quickly make a distinction, because a lot of people they are against big weddings, but I'm not against big weddings in terms of the quantity. Like you've already given an example. It's not about big meaning the quantity. It's about big versus lavish wedding, right? So the same person, again, I know people that have done small weddings in terms of quantity, but the amount that they've spent is actually more than what the average person will spend on a 500, person wedding, right? So I think there definitely is a distinction between lavish and large, big wedding. So I think you can have a big wedding, but just not be lavish, like you've said, right? So again, I'd give you an example. I went to a Somali wedding, and mashallah, Somali community, huge numbers. I think there was about 700 people there, 750 people there. Big, that's a large number. Hall was booked out, quite a renowned hall. But when I went there, like you mentioned, the groom was sitting on the floor, on the stage, on the floor. Everybody was on the floor. Literally, they brought out the food. The nikah was done. Everyone enjoyed the food, took some photos, and went home. Right. So at the end of the day, that was a big wedding, but that was not lavish whatsoever. Like the cost would not have been much. So do you agree with that? Lavish versus big?
Agreed completely. And just think back, I guess, to all of the weddings. I mean, you've been to a fair few, much more than normal people, I think. But I'm just thinking back to all the weddings I've been to, and they're all kind of unmemorable. People go to the wedding, have the meal. I think most people, frankly, me myself included, turn up for the meal, and everything else is kind of, that fine.
memory kind of thing. Yeah.
And it just kind of, it just doesn't, you don't remember it. And that's important as a point for everyone to think about, because, of course, it's the center of your life when you're getting married, and for the parents, it's, very, very important for them. But, you have to frame it in the context of, the 100 or 500 people coming. At least 400 of them probably don't even know you really that well. They don't fundamentally care that much. And once you have that awakening, I think it'll free you up a lot as well, because you realize, actually, you know what, people aren't that bothered, so I can be quite free with how I want to have my wedding, and it's my life. And I actually think there's another wider point here, which is the groom needs to man up a bit, and I think, in Islam, the groom is supposed to be the head of the family, and they need to have like that kind of leadership role in the household and be able to make the tough decisions at some points. And the tough decisions start here. And I'm not saying, be undiplomatic or, break ties or anything like that. But I think that, you shouldn't also just roll over because, your family or the family of the other side would like to have a, lavish wedding. Because that sets the precedent, I think, for a lot of things. And it also sets the precedent for how much barakah there is in the wedding. And you kind of want to, stamp your kind of, I guess, authority, or you want to put your kind of mark on how your relationship is going to go, because no one else is ultimately going to be married. You two are.
Yeah, exactly. One thing you mentioned was the food, right? So a lot of people, they do genuinely go for the food, and that's why I actually tell couples this. I'm like, if you're going to spend money on anything, spend some good money on the food. It's the opposite. So they spend really good money on like the venue and the cars and this and that, and they try and cut costs when it comes to the food. Well,
Oh,
at least spend good money on the food. Get a nice meal that everyone's going to enjoy, because that's pretty much what people are there for, right? I mean,
yeah.
and I always say, look, there's nothing wrong with that either. I mean, it's from the Sunnah. A walima is literally announcing the nikah and feeding people. So there's nothing wrong. There's no shame in feeding people and people enjoying that meal. Why cut costs when it comes to the meal? Good meal and everything else. I mean, I've been to weddings where there's been fireworks. I mean, really, who goes to a wedding to see like it's just extra, kind of display, like trying to keep people happy. I get it. So just part of your research, let's quickly break down some costs. I remember you mentioning some costs. Do you remember off the top of your head, like where most of the costs are going towards? I know venues was definitely a big one.
Venues is, I think, the biggest one.
Yeah.
I think it's typically half of it will go to the venue. So if you can control that cost, then you, I think, save yourself a lot of headache. And I guess the kind of options you have are, you've got your kind of country golf resort type thing. Then you've got your hotels. Then you get the cheaper hotels. Then you get the community centers and the masajid. And obviously, shop around. And I think you can actually get some great deals at things like, the Travel Lodge or something, where they've got halls for hire. So it doesn't have to be completely like, budget. But at the same time, I think, if you can be quite, I guess, punchy there, and then maybe even use decorations, or maybe use some clever kind of nudge theory, where you make something that looks quite simple on the face of it actually look quite nice. I think is probably a better way of going about it than trying to than spending money getting something that already looks perfectly nice.
Yeah. I think you can do that with like centerpieces and like some basic decor and things. I think you can be quite resourceful with these types of things.
Agreed. And I mean, I remember we had a wedding in, and you probably know it. There's quite a big Jamaat Islami masjid in Birmingham,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
all downstairs. So my last brother who got married, his wedding was there, and I remember the people who were supposed to serve, because what my mum did, this is actually a good way of saving costs, is disaggregate the costs. because sometimes you'll just give a whole contract to one person, and they will kind of handle everything, but then there's a lot of kind of profit there. But if you disaggregate and say, okay, you know what, I'm not going to give it to, let's say, a restaurant that does the serving and the food and the venue. I'm actually going to sort the venue out. I'm going to sort the servers out. I'm going to sort the cutlery out, and I'm going to sort the food out separately. A little bit more work, but overall it ends up being cheaper. And all things were going to plan on my brother's wedding until the servers at the last moment decided not to turn up. And so at that point, we had my entire family in our kind of suits, running,
No way.
serving ourselves. And it was absolutely manic. But actually, you know what? No one really, I think, noticed it or cared that much. And it goes to show that actually maybe we should have just not paid the servers in the first place. We could have just
Yeah.
done it.
You know, one thing that just came to my mind while you were breaking that down is, one thing I forgot to mention is, we're not just talking about weddings here with Muslims, because there's sometimes 3-4 different functions involved.
Yeah.
Leading up and post wedding, right? The mehendi type thing. You've got sometimes there's an engagement party. Walima is separate to the wedding or the nikah. So we're talking 3-4, and sometimes there's literally 2-3 different venues involved with that as well. So I think if we're talking about cutting down costs, I think a great way is just to somehow get everything in one kind of thing. Like that's what I personally went for as well. Instead of trying to like do everything separately, is like the nikah, wedding, walima type, the reception was all just kind of done in one. But yeah, I think it's quite common that nowadays loads of different functions, and those little costs, you may think, oh, it's only £1,000 on this engagement, but that is adding up, if you put everything together.
Enormously. I mean, as long as you don't have the honeymoon in the same community center you do it, I think that's
Yeah.
where I draw the line. I think you can go and
Yeah.
have a nice honeymoon. Actually, I think again that's a good point, because the honeymoon is a place where, again, you shouldn't be extravagant, but I think if you expend a decent amount of money there to make sure that you're not living in a kind of rat infested 1-star kind of youth hostel, I think is sensible for 2 reasons. One is, I think it sets a good kind of precedent to your marriage. The wife in particular will be probably feeling relatively vulnerable, and you don't really know how things are going to kind of pan out. So you want to make it comfortable for her, but also it's an investment into your relationship, right? That's where you're, for the first time, going to spend time with each other. And the last thing you want is that kind of mental overhead of having to deal with the kind of leaky faucet in the toilet, which needn't be an issue, right? It just shouldn't be in your kind of mental overhead at all. So yeah, I think a good kind of principle is invest in the long term and invest in the relationship, and everything else, yeah, cut away.
Yeah, I agree. I think definitely if you can cut down on the other costs and put it towards a honeymoon, a nice little holiday to start things off, I think that's definitely a worthwhile investment. We've spoken about, in terms of like overcoming, we've spoken about some of the issues like the societal / family pressures of things, right? And I think, we've spoken about just trying to be sensible as possible. Let's maybe gear towards now the practical side of things, right? Because it is important. We spoke about how uneconomic it is. It's also quite un-Islamic to be spending that amount of money, and then the issues that arise thereafter with the debts and everything else. It's not a nice position to be in, let's just say, right? Now, one thing that I'm really big on before even a person decides to get married is, what I like to call financial maturity, because maturity could be psychological, it could be spiritual, right? Because a lot of people ask this question, like, how do I know when I'm ready to get married? So something that we always talk about is having financial maturity. And I guess that involves a lot of different things that you can elaborate on a lot more than I can, which is even things like just being good with like money management, for example. Like there's many people, they've been working for many years, they've got a good income, good salary coming in, but they just don't know how to save money. And clearly those people are going to struggle more than anyone else when it comes to marriage, right? Because you now have responsibilities. You're not taking care of yourself anymore. There's other people involved. You've got a wife, you've got kids. So is there anything firstly you want to say on this concept of like financial maturity, and then I guess we can talk about maybe some tips and so on.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually. I think it was the most difficult of the questions you sent me beforehand. I think it's very hard to kind of come up with an exact kind of list of tick this and therefore you are financially mature. But I think there are some really good indicators of when you are not financially mature. A good a financially mature person will typically have something left over every month after all their bills are done. And someone who is not mature will typically, be going into debt every month. And I think another way that you can look at that is, a financially mature person will probably have had some experience of managing, their own finances, but actually also household finances. So the utility bills, the council tax, dealing with the gardener. They have experience of being on a 45-minute phone call with EE to cancel a broadband or something. That's all part of, I think, financial maturity and growing up. They're the kind of people who I think are able to ask the difficult question when for example, negotiating with a market stall, for example, or even at a currency exchange. Someone who isn't financially mature will kind of they'll back down. They won't really have the courage to do that. And I think there's a kind of link to financial maturity and earning your own income, because at that point you kind of realize how hard it is, and so you want to make sure that you get as much bang for your buck as you possibly can. I think that financial maturity is almost like, so we do a lot of startup investing at Islamic Finance Guru, and when you're looking at a startup founder, you're looking at a track record, and if ideally he's done one before, right? So if it's your second marriage, then you're like, okay, great, he knows what he's doing. But if it's your first marriage, you're looking at, okay, what kind of track record does he have of managing ideally a whole household at a profit, and ideally growing that savings pot. Think of it like thinking of marriage like a business now, and that's a really good indicator. If he doesn't have that, okay, fine, he lives with his parents and he's going to move out shortly. What kind of salary is he on, and how much credit card debt does he have? Because if he has a lot of credit card debt and he's got a large salary, that tells you that this man is spending away, or this woman is spending away, and that's not a good look. So I guess there's a whole range of different things in there, and ultimately, I think when you hit financial maturity, then you kind of know, I think, as well. So very, very hard to pin down, but I guess those are kind of the kind of ways to think about this concept.
Yeah, I think, definitely. I don't think it's something that's as straightforward. It's just like saying spiritual maturity, like that could involve so many different elements and that could really range from each individual to another. So I think, similarly with financial maturity, I think it does involve lots of different things. There's many factors involved, but I think it's something that definitely needs to be thought about more before people get married as opposed to after, because I think that's when you start to run into a lot of problems, or you start to look towards taking out loans, like we said, which really does not help. And it just ends up being this kind of spiral, right? You just can't get out of now. Again, just from my experience speaking to people, it's just very upsetting to see how people that have been saving for a lot of years comes to the wedding and honeymoon, etc., and that's that. Like they're now in debt, and now they've got years down the line they've got their own kids still paying off those debts, and it's not a nice position to be in. And like we said, even from an Islamic perspective, Muslims do need to think about this a lot more, right? And I guess the famous verse which is quoted when it comes to spending, so we know the concept of israf anyway, which is like being extravagant. Allah condemns this in the Quran. But also just when he talks about spending, he mentions kana baina dhalika qawama, isn't it? Like, be in between. Don't spend so extravagantly and just keep spending and shopping. At the same time, don't be so stingy and miserly, like
Yeah.
withholding your wealth, which I guess is another issue, which we can talk about another time. Which some people actually, this is an issue. Like, they don't know, they've just holding on to their money and they don't want to spend it, because they're just thinking about overthinking, I guess, so many different elements of the future. So I guess trying to strike that balance is very, very. It's not easy, but I think it's important to think about. I wanted to end with some tips that I want you to share, inshallah, especially for young Muslims. Let's say that are looking to getting married. They are saving up. They're thinking about their future. Maybe they've listened to this podcast. They've checked out some videos on Islamic Finance Guru, and they're thinking ahead. So, what tips would you give them about just generally, saving wise, investments, thinking about the future, thinking ahead?
Yeah, really good question. So I think one thing that I would highly encourage is for the groom in particular to take real ownership over the costs. Inevitably, I think there will need to be some help from the family to make it happen. But the more that the groom can take ownership over, I will pay for this myself. That the more control he has over what is going to happen. And also, I think it's just a good kind of way of getting yourself into that discipline. So I remember the year before my marriage, I was basically just working every weekend, tutoring, and just saving up money through that. Because I just had this thing that I wanted to kind of pay as much of my wedding for my wedding as possible, because that's like that's my responsibility, it's no one else's. And I think that stood me in a lot of good stead. So that's the first thing. I think the other kind of tips that I would say is use things like, I mean, if you're that way inclined, then use things like Monzo, or there's another kind of movement called You Need a Budget, YNAB, I think it's called. So check those guys out and draw yourself up a budget. Monzo, what they do is if you set a budget on your account, it will basically tell you when you've hit that. And so you can kind of keep yourself accountable. And there's other things that you can do using things that I think Monzo do as well, but Moneybox, where it automatically saves a little bit, the pennies, whenever you spend. It saves those away every single transaction, and that starts mounting up. The other approach is, just set yourself a direct debit, and something that you can afford and stick with, and then just forget about it. It's not even that frankly important where you put it, as long as it's like somewhere half kind of decent and safe-ish, like Wahid or AJ Bell, an Islamic fund by AJ Bell. You can go on our website. There's a halal investment page, and basically just choose something relatively medium or low risk in there. Set a direct debit and forget about it. And it's things will go up and down, but the important thing is that you're saving things away, and that's where ultimately you'll see a lot of real kind of returns over the long term. I guess another thing when you're going to save away money for a marriage is think about how far away it is. So if it's 10 years down the line, for some reason, like let's say you're a particularly hardworking 16-year-old who knows that he's not going to get married for like 10 years, say, but he's earning, then you can be a little bit more ambitious with where you put your money, because you can go for the kind of high return investments where you will have to lock that money away for 5+ years, and go for that strategy. But for most people, they'll be probably looking at a 2-3 year time frame. So you can't go for an investment that's going to lock that money away for 5 years. You're probably going to have to end up going for like the stock market typically, or other kind of short-term investments. Sometimes in property can come up, and even in a new company called Qardus, where you're investing in Islamic Sharia compliant loans to other companies. Basically, there's a whole bunch of things, but if you look for the short-term options, that's where it'll probably make more sense for you. And then I think the other tip is budget out your wedding quite early, and just say and put that on the table with your family. Get them bought into it. And look, so this is my income. This is how much I'm saving. I want to get married. It's going to take 2-3 years to get to 10, 15K, and that's what I want to spend on the wedding, and that's kind of all I can afford. Now, if you do that 2, 3 years down the line, and your family then see you working hard for 2, 3 years to achieve that, they're much less likely to then say, "Oh, actually, Beta, I want you to do a 40K wedding," because they're like, that will just be, awful for my son who's been working day and night for 2, 3 years to save up 15K to then say, "Oh, actually, you know what? You need to do like a 3 times the amount instead." So do that. I think that can help with kind of the buy-in aspect. And then I think also just hard graft, because if you think that your current salary is not going to get you much savings, then there's two options for you. One is get a job that pays more, and it might be a little bit harder work, and you have to sacrifice a bit for that period of time. Fine, so that's one option. Or the other option is keep your job as it is, but then also do evening gigs or weekend gigs and do kind of side hustles and what have you. And that has two benefits. One is money, and the other one is actually three benefits. The other one is money. The other one is it could potentially become a full-on business. And then I think the third one is that it will teach you skills and complementary kind of things that you just wouldn't otherwise have had. So I guess those are the kind of ways to go about saving money. Also, take advantage of any tax breaks that you can get hold of as well. And there are many. Like if you have a relatively low income, then you may be eligible for some kind of universal credit or the like. Take advantage of that. If you're disabled, then you might get, again, disability benefits. Take advantage of that, because that's you will have already paid taxes or will be paying plenty of taxes to pay for that. So take advantage of what you can, but obviously don't lie, because that would be haram.
I like the ending there. Just a quick don't do this, is haram, basically. But no, excellent points that you mentioned. I think there's a lot to unpack there. Definitely. I liked what you mentioned about just firstly taking ownership. I think it's just being vocal at that point. I think it's just so important, and just being kind of brave enough to say, you know what, I have worked hard for this. This is all I can afford. And in a really respectful manner, just saying, if you want something more than that, then feel free to pitch in and pay for those things. But like, that's what I can afford. This is what I'm going for. I think that's an amazing thing. And I think also what you mentioned about just side hustles and just trying to get things done. I think if there's any time to do it, it would probably be before getting married, because you don't want to be doing that after you're married and just not giving any time whatsoever to your house and to your family. I think if you want to, before that, experiment, try things out, try a business here and there, even if it means failing and learning. I think why not? I think that's a perfect time in your 20s, mid-20s. I think awesome time, go for it, try things out. So yeah, amazing tips. Lot to unpack there, like we said, but of course we can always redirect people to Islamic Finance Guru if they want to find out more. What's happening with that? I know you've gone full time now. Anything new that we're expecting?
I guess not huge. I guess we're relaunching our halal investing for busy professionals course in the next inshallah few weeks. So maybe that's one thing to watch out for. We've had it running for about a year and a half now, which alhamdulillah hundreds of people have benefited from. And all those people who have bought it previously, they'll be able to access this new one. But I guess we need to kind of keep on updating it as more and more new investment opportunities come up. And then I guess the other exciting, I don't know if it's exciting, but the other cool news is that we're going to be revamping our wills side of things as well. So we have IFG Wills, which is like an online Islamic will service, because there's many reasons why we do it, but I think the primary reason is that doing it helps people ultimately save tens of thousands of pounds in tax. And we're in the process of revamping that, because now we've got a tech lead who's going to come in and help us with that. So watch out for that as well.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. I think it's much needed. I didn't know that you had that side of things with the wills, so I'll definitely be checking that out. Wish you all the best with Islamic Finance Guru, inshallah. And thank you so much once again, Jazakallah khair, for joining us on the podcast. And for everyone else, I hope you enjoyed. And I hope this was informative, super informative. We talked everything about Muslim weddings and saving up and financial maturity and all of those things, inshallah. Be sure to subscribe, check us out on social media, and we will be back with another podcast very, very soon, inshallah. Take care of yourselves. For myself, Shabbir, I will see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.